Hello and welcome to the Professing Alls. My name is Ryan and this is our 8th video. Now behind me on the board, we've got a few extra paradigms that we've got to learn, okay? A few extra conjugations. Now don't freak out. These conjugations run along the similar principles of the conjugation that we have already learned, but there are slight differences. Now there are some verbs, well, almost all verbs in Greek end with that omega ending in the first person singular. So you have agapao, for example, which is I love, okay? Or we've seen echo, I have, akuo, I hear, vlepo, I see. Okay, so we already know a few verbs. Now there are a few verbs where the omega, it follows either an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron. Now, if there is an alpha, epsilon, or omicron followed by an ending, usually that letter, that alpha, epsilon, or omicron, will have a little bit of an influence on the vowels in the ending, okay? So there are three categories of these endings. So you have the alpha, omega endings. So the example I have here is agapao, which is I love. And phileo, which also means I love. And the law, which means I show. Now, yes, there are two words in Greek for I love. There are actually four words for love. We're not going to get into the specifications of that, but for now, they mean the same thing, okay? Agapao and phileo mean I love equally, okay? We're not going to get into the details on that. Not in this episode anyway, but just so you know the meaning of the word. Now, when an alpha is followed by an omega in the first person singular, now with all of them, firstly, let's look at what's the same between all of them, okay? So the first similarity, in the first person singular, usually you have a contraction with all the vowels into the omega, and the omega takes a circumflex. Now remember, the circumflex indicates contraction, okay? So normally there would be an acute over the second, the syllable just before the ending, okay? But if the syllable disappears and mixes with the ending, okay, now the accent falls on that same ending where that letter would have been, where that accent should have been, and now it's got to change to a circumflex to show that contraction took place. So agapao, alpha omicron, or alpha omega I should say, contracts into omega. So an accent wants to go on that alpha, but there's no alpha there because it's contracted. So the accent falls on where the alpha would be, but it becomes a circumflex, okay? So with all these forms, the circumflex will fall on the very first syllable of the ending because the first syllable of the ending would have contracted with the letter before it, okay? And this is how you can tell whether it falls in one of these three categories or in the first category. So if there's an acute accent and it's an omega class verb, that is, it has an omega in the first person singular ending, then you know it's always going to follow echo. If it's got a circumflex, then it'll follow one of these three, okay? So all of them do this. So you have agapo, philo, vilo, okay? I love, I show. Here in the second person singular, they all keep the iota and sigma on the ending, okay? So here, the epsilon, the two epsilons form one epsilon, okay? So there's contraction that's taken place, and now you have a circumflex. So philis looks exactly the same as echis, the same ending, but the circumflex accent shows that there was contraction taking place, and that it's an E-class verb. So an E-class just means it has an epsilon in the ending. So it's epsilon omega. Then same thing here. So the omicron and epsilon contract and they just produce an omicron, okay? So it just goes from being epsilon iota to omicron iota because it's got an omicron in the ending. Now the alpha does something a little bit different. Now the iota stays there, and the alpha and the epsilon contract, and you have an alpha at the ending. But the iota in classical Greek started not being pronounced in this form. So instead of saying in using Erasmus pronunciation, agapais, they would just say agapas, agapas. But historically, there was an iota there. There should be an iota in that form. So to clarify that there would have been an iota in the form, the iota is written under the alpha and it's called an iota subscript. Okay, so you'll find some words with these little iotas under either an alpha or an eta or an omega, and it just means historically there used to be an iota there, but it's no longer pronounced. Okay, so this is pronounced, if you're using either pronunciation, is agapas, agapas. So you ignore the iota subscript, you don't pronounce it. Okay. Now, same thing when you go into the third person, in the same way how you go echo, I have, echis, you have, echi, you drop that sigma, now you have the third person, he has. Same thing here, you just drop the sigma, and actually this is wrong. I accidentally had a sigma there. Okay, so these forms are relatively easy to learn, okay? So agapao, agapas, agapa. I love, you love, he loves. Philo, philis, phili. I love, you love, she loves. Dilo, dilis, dili. I show, you show, it shows. Okay, now let's get to the bottom section. Okay, now normally, so thinking back to echo, you have echomen, echomen. So you have epsilon he, which is the root of the word, and the ending is omicron mi epsilon ni. Okay, so that omicron is going to mix with an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron and produce a different sound. So in the case of alpha, the omicron and omega do the same thing. They both produce an omega. Okay, just contract into an omega. So it does the exact same thing as agapao with the omega ending. So it produces agapomen. Agapomen. However, if it's with an epsilon or an omicron, so you have double omicron or epsilon omicron, it produces an omicron epsilon. Okay, so instead of philomen, you say philumen, philumen, and the lumen, the lumen. Now, in this form here, this does pretty well the same thing. So back here, we had epsilon, iota, sigma, okay, in the ending of echis. Here it'd be echete. So it does the same thing, but echete, that ete ending, doesn't have an iota. Okay, so the epsilon and iota and alpha still contract to an alpha with the circumflex, but there's no need for an iota subscript because there's no iota historically there. If you have two epsilons together, they produce an epsilon iota. Okay, so that's why there's an iota there. It's not because historically an iota is there, but an epsilon plus epsilon creates epsilon iota. And an epsilon followed by an omicron followed by an epsilon is the same thing as an epsilon followed by an omicron, and it produces the U sound. U. So dilute. Dilute. Now, similarly, the epsilon omicron or epsilon omicron epsilon and omicron omicron epsilon does the same thing as here, and it produces an omicron epsilon with the circumflex. So you have philucin and dilucin. And an alpha followed by an omicron produces an omega. So you have agaposin, and the epsilon just drops out at this point. Agaposin. So here are the rules that I've written down here. Now, you don't need to necessarily memorize the rules, but it is good to see why certain forms take the forms that they have. Okay. Now, this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm hopeful that you can sort of see the patterns that have been happening here. Obviously, I can't write absolutely everything on my whiteboard to show you all the different forms and how the contractions have taken place, but this sums up all the contractions. And if you have a piece of paper in front of you, if you're not quite following me, just rewatch the video and write out the form of echo, okay, all the forms of echo, and you'll be able to follow what I'm saying. So write echo, echis, echi, echo menechete, echi, echusen. Have that beside you and just sort of look and compare to these things and the things that I'm saying and the way that the contractions are taking place. Okay? Now, what I want to say, firstly, or lastly, I should say, the last thing we're going to talk about is the accent rule. Okay? Now, if you're wanting to learn the rules of the accents, this is the time that I'm going to be talking a little bit about it, okay? We're not going to go into all the details. We're just going to be talking about omega class omega class verbs, okay? If you're not interested in accents, stop the video now, okay? This section's not for you. You don't need to worry too much about this. Now, with the accents in a regular verb, so let's take didasco, okay? And let's take another example. Let's take agapao, which is I love and I teach. Now, the ending of the word is here, okay? So the root of the word of didasco, which is the part of the word which isn't going to change based on its form, is didask, okay? Didask. And then you have o, didasko, didaskis, didaski, didaskomen, didaskite, didaskusen. And then here, it's the same thing. Agapa, okay? Now, the acute accent is always used on that last syllable when you take the ending off, okay? It is always going to be there in the singular, when we're using the present tense, okay? Just when we're using the present tense. So it doesn't matter what the ending is, it's always going to look like that. Now, because the alpha contracts with the ending, with the alpha omega class verbs or epsilon omega verbs or omicron omega verbs, you are not going to have that ending there. Instead, you're going to have that circumflex on the ending to show that there was contraction, because the accent wants to go here, there should be an alpha here, but it contracts with the ending and produces that circumflex, okay? So it's always, for the contract or liquid verbs, it's always going to fall on that first syllable of the ending. So if you have a single syllable, so like omega, epsilon iota sigma, epsilon iota, like as in phileo, it's always going to fall on this first syllable, okay? If you have more than one syllable in the ending, so for example, omen, no, let's take umen. So we're taking fil, so I love. So filumen, so it's still on the first syllable, it's not going to the last. And filite, still on the first. And filusin, still going on the first, not on the last, okay? So it's always going to be on the first syllable. Doesn't matter what that syllable is, whether it's agapao, agapas, agapa, agapamen, agapate, agaposen, or the phileo forms or the thelo forms. Doesn't matter, the circumflex is always going to be on the first syllable of the ending. Of a regular omega verb without those alpha, epsilon, omega endings, it's always going to be on the last syllable of the main form of the verb, okay? So what this means is that you are able to tell in the present tense if something is a contract or liquid verb, a contract verb, that is, it has an alpha, epsilon, or omega on the or omicron before the ending, or if it's just a regular omega verb without any epsilon, alpha, or omicron. So if it has an acute, doesn't have the alpha or epsilon or omicron on the ending. If it has the circumflex, then it does. Okay, but that's only in the present tense. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about with the accents for now. And I'm sure you would have noticed that as we were going through the paradigms anyway, but I just wanted to point it out so that way it's clear in case you didn't pick it up or didn't know why the rules were the way they were. Now, the There are more specific rules than that. We're not going to get into those details at the moment, okay? That should be enough for you at the moment. And if you're wanting to watch the next video, stick around, and there should be another video that I'll put up within the next week or two, going into the next stuff that we're going to be looking at, which is nouns, okay? So we're going to start creating basic sentences. We're not going to look at absolutely everything to do with nouns, but we're just going to have a little bit of a play with the verbs that we've already used, and we're just going to use them a little bit with nouns, okay? So that's basically what we're going to be doing in the next video, is just learning a few nouns and then playing with some of the verbs that we've already learnt using some of those nouns, okay? So we'll see you in the next video, and like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you're on Rumble, follow me there. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. It'd be really good to have you support the channel here. We'll see you in the next video.